The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, my name is Rebecca Wallace. I am hosting this webinar on behalf of Chuck Bargeron. He is at a meeting right now, and so I will be introducing our presenters, and I will also be taking people's questions. If you have a question, you can put it in the chat box, and at the end of each presentation, you can ask your questions and I'll relay them to the presenter. You can type them in there during the talk, and we'll just ask the questions at the end. So these we're going to have two presentations. The headline for the webinar kind of looked like it was one presentation by two people, but it is indeed two separate presentations. The first is from Lee Van Wyken. Lee was born and raised on a dairy farm just outside of Green Bay, Wisconsin. He has a bachelor's of science in agronomy and horticulture and a master's degree in weed science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and a PhD in weed science from Montana State University. After his PhD work, he went to DC to work on Capitol Hill for a few years, covering agriculture and environmental policy for two members of Congress. Since 2005, he has served as our Executive Director of Science Policy for the National and Regional Weed Science Societies. Today, he'll be talking about 20 years of NISAW, and I will turn this over to Lee now.
Well, thank you very much, and it is indeed an honor to kick off the webinar portion of this NISAW. And it is 20 years. It's hard to believe it's been that long already. And going back and reflecting on some of the years, we've had good years and not so good years, but we've definitely advanced the needle on invasive species awareness. So just to start out, we will go back kind of the beginning. The Invasive Species Executive Order 13112 that was signed 21 years ago and a couple weeks, February 3rd, 1999. It defined invasive species that are as species that are not native to the ecosystem under consideration, and further went on to say whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. So that was signed by President Clinton, and that kind of started and helped bring about this momentum that was actually National Invasive Weeds Awareness Week. The first 10 years of NISAW was actually a NIWA, National Invasive Weeds Awareness Week. And that executive order established the Invasive Species Council, which we'll talk about just a little bit, and also the advisory committee, and told them to put together a federal invasive species management plan, which we've gone through several now since the inception of the executive order. So just a quick primer on the National Invasive Species Council. There's 13 departments and administrators that are the overall council members. These are the the chiefs of the agencies. The co-chair principals are agriculture, interior, and commerce. And to my knowledge, I don't think they've ever, all three of them, got together as a full Invasive Species Council meeting, but I could be wrong, and I'd have to go and talk to Lori Williams or Jamie to see if that's happened. But we've had a lot of interaction with these agencies. There's policy liaisons for each of these departments and agencies, and those have changed over the years. I know in Interior, Hillary Smith is that liaison. For USDA, it's Samantha Simon, sorry Samantha, and so they are there as the chief liaisons to those agencies to the council, and then you have reps, 35 reps for each of those. Within USDA, you have National Institute of Food and Agriculture, you have ARS, you have APHIS, so each of those agencies have reps. There's 35 reps. Then you have the Federal Advisory Committee, the Invasive Species Advisory Council, ISAC. You have also the taxa teams that were even there before the executive order. FICMANU is the one I'm most familiar with, the Federal Interagency Committee for on the Management of Noxious and Exotic Weeds. So you have to be an insider to understand that acronym. And sometimes we say, if I'm mad at someone, I'll say FICMANU to you too. I shouldn't say that, but anyways. And then ANSTF is the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force, and ITAP is the Invasive Terrestrial and Animal and Pathogens. Those are taxa teams that meet regularly. So lots of people involved in the National Invasive Species Council. So just to start this off, I'd be remiss to say that these will basically be the founders of National Invasive Weeds Awareness Week. Rob Hedberg, who was my predecessor in this position, he started out doing contract work, and he was a fellow with the Weed Science Society of America in the 90s, and then came into this position I'm in now. And he really had the time and effort and passion to really gel this all together. And then Nelroy Jackson was kind of his partner in crime. And we just lost Nelroy this past summer. But if I had to put two faces with the start of NISAW, these two helped make it tick. But there is literally hundreds of other people that have been important. And I'm going to try and catch a few of them along the way as we go through the history of this. So how it began, we had the Intermountain Noxious Weed Advisory Council. You had people like George Beck, who were very influential there, and they would come to D.C. every year, and they were in the 90s. And the industry, of course, had a financial interest in some of the management. FICMANU was around and there before the executive order and kind of helped make that all happen. CAST, the Council for Agriculture and Science Technology, wrote a excellent issue paper titled Invasive Plant Species. In February 2000, you had people like Barb Mullen and Lars Anderson, Jody Tomaso, Kurt Getzinger, Bill Holler, Rod Lim, John Randall wrote and reviewed that paper. So lots of big names in invasive species management. And then, of course, WSA hired a director of science policy, that being Rob Hedberg. Then we had the first meetings of the Invasive Species Advisory Council and the North American Weed Management Association were also very important in the start of this. And NAMA became NISAW now, that's led by Belle Bergner. She gave a talk at noon on Capitol Hill. I had to dig really hard to find this piece of little nugget of information. This was before my time, before I started out here, and I found this in Rob's archives. Rob Hedberg's archives. This was the first kind of schedule, and I got part of it. I couldn't fit it all on the screen here, but it's you can kind of see, they had the National Governors Association. They had events up on Capitol Hill, at the Russell Senate Office Building. They were at the Embassy Row Hilton for the CAST issue paper. So they had a pretty good group of people already on the very first NISAW 1, National Invasive Weeds Awareness Week 1, February 27th to March 3rd, 2000. So a lot of thanks to Rob and Nelroy. I believe Nelroy was the first Invasive Species Advisory Committee chair. If he wasn't the first, he was definitely a chair for a good chunk of time there. So that was number one. And then by this slide, I've seen so many times in so many presentations that Rob and Nelroy gave, that NISAW 3, like we had the whole National Mall flooded with invasive species awareness people. This would have been awesome if this was the case, but it did grow quite dramatically in the early stages, and they had a lot of diversity in participants. They were working towards Federal Noxious Weed Control Act, and you can see there's some different strange bedfellows. You wouldn't necessarily think you'd find the National Cattlemen's Beef Association with the Union of Concerned Scientists, but they made it happen. They all had a common goal for invasive weed management and making progress towards that end. And so it's a credit to those guys for bringing these groups of people together. And this is one of my favorite slides from Rob that I've stuck in here. Daddy, what's a NISAW? You know, a bunch of people who come to Washington every year to talk about killing plants. They hold a big party at the Botanic Gardens without getting thrown out. And they pester politicians and high government officials for money without getting thrown out. So thank you, Rob, for that slide. I have a 5- and 7-year-old that asks what's a NISAW or a NISAW, so I tell them the same thing. Some of the other activities that have happened through both NISAW and NISAW, you know, they had an orientation and kickoff sessions. We've had quite a good interaction at the Botanic Garden, the U.S. Botanic Garden. It's right up there by the Capitol, and with the receptions, and of course, you know, the first 10 years focus was NISAW, which was just weeds, you know, so being in a plant place was a perfect setting. And then also, you know, these Kids Day events that we had there were excellent times, you know, to outreach to the local community here. We've also had Kids Day events at the Smithsonian, some of the Smithsonian museums. So there's been a lot of great activity for education and awareness. Some of the, you know, key partners that really made this happen, you know, were USDA and Interior in particular. You know, with Interior with the major land management agencies, and USDA with some of the research. CSRES became NIFA, the National Institute of Food and Agriculture. You know, the Forest Service. So lots of good partners. And then we had, of course, other main participants, you know, Department of Defense, you know, Pete Egan, you know, was there. The Armed Forces Pest Management Board. Is shocking how much land the Department of Defense manages, and the problems that they were dealing with on invasive. Department of Transportation, of course, EPA, the Smithsonian, Botanic Gardens. Lots of people have an interest in this. And here's some more examples of non-federal participants that were involved, and I kind of had a list there earlier. This is just a little bit more of an expanded list. All very important in the initial 5 to 10 years of NISAW. By 2006, we were at the Four Points Hotel by Sheraton. And it's always typically been the last week in February. It's a week after the President's Day recess. This would have been awesome if President Bush was sending us money for invasive plant management, but he's certainly aware of invasive weeds on his ranch in Crawford, and this is a picture from that. We had a NIFWIF Pulling Together Initiative grant that helped fund some of the education and awareness activities for a number of years, and that was very helpful. And this, you can see, we had 2 official NISAW positions, the Noxious Weed Control and Eradication Act, which the participants of NISAW were successful at getting passed through Senator Larry Craig's office. And there was $15 million of funding that was authorized in that bill, but unfortunately that we could never get that to materialize. And I'll come back and touch on that a little bit. But there's always a fine line between, you know, our federal participants who obviously cannot lobby and would never go up to the Hill. And so we've been very cognizant of that, but yet trying to keep, you know, a legislative presence with all of our non-federal partners that would fly in. By this time, we were pushing up to 200 people flying in for the week. So the 10th National Invasive Weeds Awareness Week, this is the last week where we had there was a NISAW, and then we had, I just want to mention some of these names here quick, you know, Al Tasker, Sheriff Al with APHIS, Mike Almini, Forest Service, you know, Ellen Gable at the Fish and Wildlife Foundation, Janet Clark, Liz Galley Noble with the Center for Invasive Plant Management at Montana. At Interior, you had Gina Ramos with BLM, and she's still there. You know, Rita Beard has since passed on. You know, Sue Salmons, Michael Lusk, Jenny Erickson, all names that have played a major role in many of the early NISAWs that put a lot of time and effort and volunteered that time for the most part. So we're very thankful for them. And I know I'm leaving off probably hundreds of names of people that have volunteered time, but these are some of the big ones. Here's just an example of the NISA 10 schedule. You know, we had kickoff meeting at the hotel. There was at that point there was the Healthy Habitats Coalition that was working out west. You know, and I think I cut off the part. There was a kids' day at the Botanic Gardens on Sunday. But as you can see, there's, you know, lots of things happening during the week, and there's always been, you know, an awards reception, which has been nice. And then we switched to All Taxa in 2010. That was our 11th invasive 11th event. Janet Clark was kind of helped co-chair and lead that effort, and this is just one snapshot of the agenda that week. This was a Tuesday, and it showed kind of who we had on the schedule, and every day we had kind of a different theme. This was energy. I think we had climate change, and I forget there's another one, but the overall, you know, motto was invasive species change in dollars. So Janet was very involved. Jamie Reeser was very involved in this as well. And then we shifted gears and went, the National Invasive Species Council and Lori Williams kind of took over, and they really helped keep it going. And, you know, it was kind of a natural fit for the National Invasive Species Council because, you know, that's one of their main management goals is education and awareness, you know, of invasive species. So we were cruising along pretty good, 2011, 2012, and you know, we had our kids' days. One was at the Botanic Garden, another was at the Smithsonian Museum. Then we hit 2013. We had the sequestration fiasco, and there's, you know, big fight between Congress and the president over the budget caps, and so like 2 days before National Invasive Species Awareness Week, we knew that the government was going to shut down. And as we just went through a government shutdown, we know it can be disruptive. And of course, the hotel contract for all the people flying in was with the National Invasive Species Council, and so we had to cancel the week. We did have the event at the Botanic Garden, the Kids' Day, since the government wasn't shut down yet at that point. But then that kind of threw us for a loop and really took a lot of air out of our sails, so to speak. Our pets' heads were falling off. I mean, it was traumatic. And we kind of went back to the drawing board, and we didn't have an event in 2014. So we went 2 years without an official NISAW event. However, we kind of we got back into the game, and there was a lot of push. Like, we still needed an invasive species awareness week. That's what all the stakeholders were saying. So, you know, the Invasive Species Council helped push through to get an event in 2015, and then we had Scott Cameron step up. You know, and Scott has a lot of ties to the invasive species crowd and has started his own coalition, the Reduce Risk from Invasive Species Coalition. So Scott did a, you know, bang up job bringing in a lot of bigwigs and stakeholders for the National Invasive Species Awareness Week event in 2016. And you can see some of the events there. We had Representative Tulsi Gabbard in Hawaii give a big address on the House floor. And we're hoping maybe next year to recapitalize on that, since she's one of the Democratic presidential contenders. But of course, being from Hawaii, she has a lot of invasive species issues in her portfolio. So Scott did a great job, and he was since drafted into the Department of Interior. And so now Rick Godis and Alex Hosmar have been filling in Scott's place for the last couple NISAWs. So that kind of takes us up to date. And I just wanted to finish off the last few slides here. So here's some our current agency heads. The three that are the main co-chairs, the principal co-chairs, is of course Secretary Perdue from Georgia. Andrew Wheeler is not one of the main co-chairs, but EPA does fund a lot of invasive species activities, and especially the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. And then Interior, Dave Bernhardt is the acting secretary right now, but my understanding is he is on track to become to get approved as the regular secretary, as is Andrew Wheeler. And then at Commerce, we have Wilbur Ross, who oversees NOAA and the National Marine Fisheries Service. So three of those four are the principal co-chairs that are current heads of the National Invasive Species Council. The Weed Science Society, the National and Regional Weed Science Societies, does a survey that rotates every 3 years to different types of cropping systems and non-crop areas. This past year in 2018, we surveyed 3 types of aquatic areas and 10 types of common weed, or I should say 4 types of different non-crop areas. And so this is the most common aquatic weeds across the country. And this is a survey that goes out to all the aquatic weed scientists and plant managers around the country. So it's kind of shocking. The one point I wanted to make on this slide, that hydrilla would be the most common aquatic weed in the country. And this is a huge red flag, because what is hydrilla? Hydrilla is a federally listed noxious weed. Of the 112 federally listed noxious weeds, hydrilla is by far spread way across the country, way more than any other weed. And it's a real concern, because we're not getting the federal support we should be getting to battle hydrilla. And there's recent research showing that it could make it into the Great Lakes. And, it keeps spreading, and we're losing the battle on hydrilla. So, we need to get APHIS on our side to help start to, reel this in. It's in over half the states. I think it's in 30 states now, which is just completely unacceptable. So we need to get on the board for that one. You can see some of the other common weeds you'd clearly recognize in aquatic settings, all the milfoils, all the different species of pond weeds, water hyacinths, down in Louisiana and Texas. And we're even seeing, the algae species are going up the list rapidly. So some of these harmful algal blooms are starting to become a real problem. And all 50 states have algal blooms. It's just a matter of the intensity and what we're dealing with. So, and then on the non-crop areas, on the terrestrial, of course, cheatgrass or downy brome is the most common. Not a surprise on how many millions of acres it occupies in the Intermountain West and all parts of the West. And the intensity, it's increasing the intensity of the fire cycle and the frequency of the fire cycle out west. So you could say we've pretty much lost this battle completely, but is there a way to get those communities restored? And it's not just the downy brome, it's affecting the sage grouse habitat and you name it. So lots of issues with weeds. So and another one that's on this list, Kogan grass, that's another federally listed noxious weed that should not be that high up on the most common list. So we got to get some action going from the APHIS side, get some federal help. Last minute or two here, and I'll let Nancy start in. This is some good news, actually, that we had. This is the overwintering area for monarch butterflies in Mexico and their Oyamel fir forests. And so you can see the large increase that was just released here a couple weeks ago. That doesn't mean we can't or stop our restoration initiatives and our plantings, the milkweed species. Now there is milkweed, in farm fields, across the Midwest and even in the South. There's different species. I think I've seen a number of about 70 some species of milkweed. So there's areas where we want it, and then of course, areas in farmers' fields where they don't want it. So it's a fine line on establishing, that milkweed species and keeping the pollinators there. But we definitely want to see these monarchs keep increasing, because we don't want them listed by the Fish and Wildlife Service as an endangered species. That would be pretty much devastating to most of the agriculture in the Midwest, across the Midwest, I should say. So that decision is apparently supposedly coming from the Fish and Wildlife Service here in June, but I haven't heard much of an update recently. And then last but not least is a shameless plug. The Weed Science Society just had our annual meeting 2 weeks ago in New Orleans, and they approved the purchase of 1,000 board games of Weed Bingo. So yes, we have Weed Bingo coming to an outlet near you. There is Bug Bingo that already exists, and there's an example of some of the cards, like my kids play this Bug Bingo, and they recognize the insect and they match it to their bingo game card, and then on the back of these cards there's like a 40 to 60 word description of, in this case it's the insects, but we'll also have these different weeds that'll have descriptions. So we're hoping this takes off, and it's especially popular in some states that have legalized marijuana. Maybe we'll see how it goes, but Weed Bingo is coming to a place near you by this fall. So that's my shameless plug, and I will turn it back to Rebecca so Nancy can start with the second half of this. So thank you very much, and I guess I'll take some questions quick too.
Yeah, so I have a couple questions I'll ask while other people can develop theirs. So you mentioned early on in your talk that you had this might have been slightly before you, but that there was a large diversity in the partnerships at NISAW 3. Are you still seeing that same type of diversity in partnership, or has it changed or consolidated, or how? I just wanted to know how that changed in the last 10 years, 17 years, I guess.
Yeah, there's still a lot of interest from those groups. We just haven't done as good a job as reaching out to them and getting everyone involved. And so I think going forward, we got 20 years under our belt. Maybe we go back to the basics and we get an earlier start and reach out to these groups that are all dealing with invasive species issues. So it's just a matter of we need to reach back out to them and reestablish some connections. So that's we're excited about moving forward the next 20 years.
Okay. One other question I have, just because of kind of where you work and the people you tend to associate with and work with, do you know if there's any new legislation coming down, or if there's anything being talked about for relating to invasive species? Has anyone brought anything up recently?
There's some tidbits that are in the Wild Act that was just passed by the Senate, and I haven't dug through all of that yet. On the aquatic side, there was the 2018 WRDA, Water Resources and Development Act, and they greatly expanded these local boat inspection stations out west. So there was just the Columbia River Basin, and now they expanded that to like $30 million for the Upper Missouri River Basin, parts of the Colorado River Basin, and I don't want to say the wrong river basin, but they greatly expanded that from $20 million to $110 million for these watercraft inspection stations out west. So there is things happening and things that have been passed, but there's always room for improvement. So, and then, that's authorized money that I was speaking about. That's not appropriated dollars, which is a whole nother ballgame. And that's when we had this Noxious Weed Control and Eradication Act that was passed in 2004. You know, there's $15 million that was authorized, but we could never get the agency or Congress to appropriate that money. So it was very frustrating and kind of took the wind out of some of the group's sails. But I think, you know, we got to keep at it, you know.
Oh yeah, definitely. I really enjoyed seeing the lists you had for the that WSSA put out for aquatic and non-crop areas. One thing that surprised me was that salt cedar wasn't on there. Is there any? I mean, that's a huge invasive species. We get a lot of data about that, and it seems to be a big problem, especially like in riparian areas. It's a huge. It sucks up a ton of water. So I didn't. Is there anything that you were surprised wasn't on there?
Yes, salt cedar should probably be on there. Part of the list is a reflection of, you know, the number of researchers and land managers that take the survey. And so, you know, while salt cedar, you know, if you only have a couple people from Colorado or, you know, New Mexico or wherever take the survey, you know, that might not translate all the way up, you know, to the number of actual or how common it is, you know. So, yeah, salt cedar should definitely probably be on there. But it's, you know, again, it's just kind of, these are the weeds that, you know, the researchers and land managers are dealing with. So it doesn't always capture, you know, the perfect picture, of course.
Yeah. Oh, definitely, of course. I'm not seeing any other questions, so I am going to go ahead and thank Lee for giving his talk. Lee, are you going to be around just in case someone does come up with something towards the end of this?
Yes, I will.
Okay, so if anybody does have a question they think up later, we can ask Lee at the end of the webinar. But right now, I am going to go ahead and introduce our next speaker. This is going to be Nancy Rybicki. Let me just make her the presenter. There, yes, there we go. Okay, Nancy, I have made you the presenter now, and I will go ahead and introduce you. So her talk is going to be on recent detection and spread of a new type of Trapa, an invasive aquatic plant in the Potomac River watershed. So she is an aquatic plant ecologist, recently retired from the USGS Water Mission Area, Reston, Virginia, where she continues her research as a scientist emerita. In the past, she conducted long-term research projects on the increase of submersive aquatic vegetation abundance and diversity in the freshwater tidal Potomac River during a time interval when water quality improved. So she'll be talking about investigations into a recently discovered and newly identified species of water chestnut, genus Trapa, from Asia. This plant is a non-native floating aquatic plant that was discovered in 2014 in the Potomac River watershed and has been spreading rapidly since. Currently, it is reported and verified to occur in small colonies in about 30 water bodies, mostly ponds, in several northern Virginia counties. So, Nancy, if you'd like to go ahead and take over, I will mute myself, and you have a great talk.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity to present a webinar at the National Invasive Species Awareness Week's 20th anniversary. For several years, I've been trying to initiate an early detection and rapid response program for this new plant in the Potomac watershed. And I'd like to start this talk by thanking the many individuals who have already responded in many ways. Since this is not the Academy Awards, I won't mention each one by name, but I greatly appreciate all of their help. So this slide shows the water chestnut plant bed that showed up for the first time in decades. The plant bed was discovered in the Potomac in Pohick Bay. And at first, it was identified as Trapa natans. This plant is problematic in the Northeast United States and has been since the latter half of the 19th century. Its aggressive growth negatively influences aquatic ecosystem biodiversity and function and impedes hydroelectric, irrigation, and recreation. When it was first found, several organizations got together and put up these posters. These signs were placed at Potomac River boat ramps, identifying the plant, asking people to please report if they found it. Trapa natans was discovered in the Potomac in the 1920s, and it quickly spread 5 miles up and 35 miles down the river. It spread from Washington, D.C., all the way to Quantico, Virginia by 1941, where it obstructed navigation. As you can see in this photo of someone trying to boat down the Potomac. This is a journal called the Science Newsletter, and this is the front cover from September 1941. Through shading, it competed with native submerged aquatic vegetation that was considered preferable fish and waterfowl habitat. Between 1939 and 1945, the Army Corps of Engineers brought water chestnut under control using mechanical harvesters. And then for decades afterwards, the fresh tidal Potomac River was devoid of vegetation, or of submerged aquatic vegetation. In 2014, after discovering the colony, Virginia Game and Inland Fisheries coordinated a harvest. Photograph A up there in the corner shows about 30 people wading out into the Potomac, and they were given bushel baskets, and they had like an assembly line where they pulled the plants up, filled their bushel basket, carried it, or a boat or a canoe transported it to the pier behind them, and then each bushel basket was counted, and the harvested plants were poured into this front end loader, and this tractor moved the plants to an upland site very, very close by. The plot over in panel E shows the water chestnut abundance harvested from the Pohick Bay from 2014 to 2018. And in 2014, when we figured out that it was there and it needed to be harvested, we didn't get to it until about September, and the plants had already set seeds for the following year. So by 2015, we even had more to harvest. But we learned that if you go out there early and harvest it before the seeds are produced, the following year, the amount you have to harvest really decreases. And by 2018, they harvested maybe a handful of bushel baskets. So in 2014, the USGS began a study at Pohick also, and we collected specimens and measured productivity. The U.S. Trapa natans has 4 horned fruit, but we discovered this Pohick Bay colony was a 2-horned type. The water chestnut at Pohick Bay was equally as productive as the Northeast U.S. Trapa natans, but the fruit and the flower were different in appearance. So this information led to a new study to determine the distribution, the name, and the ecology of this different type of water chestnut plant. These are the first steps in developing an early detection and eradication program. Trapa can be very difficult to identify. There are many species of Trapa described in Eurasia. A key characteristic in differentiating species in this genus is the number of barbed spines projecting from the fruit. Because of the morphological variation, there is little agreement about the number of species in this genus. And the naming convention of Trapa species varies by country and within countries. So this photograph at the bottom shows a comparison of the fruit of Trapa natans in Maryland on the left versus the Trapa SP in Virginia. So because we did not know what its name was, we have labeled it Trapa SP. Water chestnut is an annual. It has edible fruit with medicinal qualities. It sprouts from seeds in spring, and the plants die off after a hard frost. The seeds can be found along the shoreline of water bodies, even in winter when all the green portion of the plant has died back. And some seeds are dormant in the sediment for years. Water chestnut is native to Europe, Asia, and tropical Africa, and its United States distribution is limited to the northeast portion of the United States. So our study objectives in 2014 and 15 were to provide natural resource managers information about this taxon, investigate its local distribution and figure out how it's being dispersed, to compare the characteristics of this two-horned Trapa in Virginia with the Trapa natans in other parts of the United States and with other species described in the worldwide literature about Trapa. We conducted a search of archived or museum records and herbarium specimens. We investigated seed dispersal at a pond in Vienna, Virginia, that I just happened to discover one day. And we did this during September and November when the fruits are mature. And we determined the characteristics of all the specimens from all the ponds and herbarium specimens that we found. And we reviewed the literature of worldwide names and the morphology corresponding to each of those names in this genus. This is a map of the Chesapeake Bay, and the Potomac River is down in the left, and the newly discovered colonies with two-horned fruits are the red dots. They're all in Virginia, and then the pre-existing colonies with the four-horned Trapa natans were located in Maryland and in the upper Chesapeake Bay. And we use these two sites that are in the green squares up in the upper right were our comparison sites to compare the Trapa natans with the Trapa SP. So Trapa SP was distributed in Potomac Bay, and it was also found in ponds and tributaries in Fairfax and Prince William counties, as you can see in the map. So when I went to all of these sites and verified the number of horns and the characteristics, and I then continued to query local managers and follow leads. I quickly found that pond owners rarely knew about or used this all of our available invasive species databases to report water chestnut. So it became an issue where I had to seek out observations on my own. These photographs were taken at Nutley Pond in Vienna, Virginia, and they show the potential transport mechanism for Trapa SP. The photograph A is Nutley Pond. It had a spillway that flowed into a tributary that is located 24 kilometers upstream of Potomac Bay. The floating rosettes and the seeds of Trapa littered the spillway, and we believe they are swept downstream during high flow events. The plants laden with these fruits and seeds just flowed right down into the nearest tributary from the pond. Photograph B shows the resident Canadian geese were foraging in Trapa SP beds in this pond, and the other photographs show that the barbed seeds of Trapa are clinging onto the geese plumage, and the seeds are very likely being transported short distances by these geese in flight. So for all the specimens I found at all the ponds and herbarium samples, Trapa SP had 2-spined fruit and 30 to 50 millimeter wide fruits, and the flowers were always pink. So I reviewed the literature, and I wrote and emailed and corresponded with Trapa specialists from around the world to determine where the two-horned Trapa may have originated. I borrowed lots of flora of all kinds of countries. I borrowed lots of books, and I also reviewed the local Smithsonian and the National Arboretum herbariums, and I saw no evidence of two-horned Trapa in the United States before now. This photograph on the right is a pressed specimen from the Smithsonian from 1920 of water chestnut that is Trapa natans, and that's also attached to this pressed specimen was a newspaper article, and its title was "Experts See Menace of Malaria in DC in the Water Chestnut." So I blew up one paragraph from that article, and it says, "The Potomac has a peculiar fascination for the plant." Colonel White from the Corps of Engineers said nowhere in the country is it so thick as right here in Washington, and he described how it was first known here in 1919 in Potomac Park fish ponds. In 1923, a growth was found near Oxen Run, and no one paid much attention to it. As a result, by 1939, it had a running start, covering almost all the shallow parts of the river. So I reviewed over about 25 journal articles and numerous flora books, ones that I could find that were written in English, and I used those to create a really long list of all the names and characteristics of any type of Trapa. Then I reduced this to just the best candidates that might turn up to be the name of this Trapa in Virginia. And then I reduced that list down to just these you see here in this table. So this table shows the species name, the country of origin, the number of spines on the fruit, fruit width, weight, and the color of the flowers, and then the citation. So these are the candidates that could provide us the name of the water chestnut we're finding in Virginia. So the next steps were to collaborate with numerous scientists and determine if Trapa SP is morphologically and genetically distinct from other water chestnut populations. So we collected Trapa samples from populations in Virginia, from the Northeast United States, outside of Virginia, South Africa, China, and Japan. We described the morphology of the leaf and fruits for each of 22 populations from around the world. Of course, the majority of these were collected, if they were from out of the United States, they were collected by volunteers in those countries. And then we conducted molecular analysis using amplified fragment length polymorphism markers. And this method was an analysis used for Trapa by Lai et al. In 2017 in China. The map shows the green symbols are the many sites in the United States, 2 sites in South Africa, 1 site in the Hubei province of China, and 1 in the province of Taiwan, and many sites were sampled in Japan. These columns show the dry fruit specimens of some of the Trapa in our study. So the rows are showing the front view, the side view, and the top view of each of those species listed at the top. So column A is Trapa SP from Virginia. Column B is Trapa bispinosa, variety Inumai, from Taiwan. C is T. natans from Maryland. Then Trapa japonica with 2 horns from Japan, Trapa japonica with 4 horns from Japan, Trapa incisa, which also has 4 horns and is very small, and then Trapa natans in column G. This is from South Africa. Column H is Trapa quadrispinosa from China, and then the last column is Trapa natans from Japan. The highlights of this aquatic botany paper were that the U.S. Trapa natans has 4-horned fruits, but a 2-horned type of Trapa was discovered recently. DNA and morphological data reveal this as a cryptic invasion of a distinct Trapa. The newly discovered Trapa in the United States is identified as Trapa bispinosa Roxbury variety Unumai in Taiwan. Distinguishing these 2 types of Trapa in the United States will be important for documenting spread and identifying new populations, and there is also a need for a worldwide review to clarify the taxonomy of Trapa. So in the U.S., the newly recognized Trapa has pink flowers, the fruit has 2 sharp horns and lacks a crown, and the underside of its leaf is reddish. On the other hand, Trapa natans has white flowers, 4 horns, and a prominent crown, and the underside of the leaf is green in the United States. Managers need more information now on phenology and distribution. So we collected preliminary data on the phenology, the flowers and fruit initiation period of Trapa in 4 sites in Virginia. And we prepared distribution maps of Trapa SP. We had 4 sites, and we observed each of these ponds at 2-week intervals, and at each date we sampled 8 rosettes. And the table below shows the day that we visited the 4 sites and the percent of rosettes that had flowers or fruits. And what we found is that in 2017, Trapa SP initiated flowers and fruits in early to mid-July, which was about a month later than Trapa natans which flowers in mid-June in Maryland. These are the 4 sites in the phenology study, and what it became quickly apparent that each of these different ponds is under a different jurisdiction. So Waples Mill Pond is Fairfax Park Authority. Pohick Bay is on the shoreline of a Northern Virginia Regional Park Authority property, and it's tidal water. Myrtle Leaf Pond was under the jurisdiction of Fairfax County, and they have a stormwater management program, so they eventually took care of that. And Industrial Road Pond is a private pond. This is in the upper left is a map of the distribution in 2017. The symbols are according to the size of the population. So the largest one is the green circle, and the color differentiates how early the first record was. So the earliest records are green, 1995 to 2001. Red are the latest records we found in 2017. So we put together this table and found that by fall of 2018, there were 18 sites. In fall of 2008. That's really fall of 2017. In 2017, the industrial pond Trapa bed was the largest colony. It had been first documented in the year 2000, and it was a George Mason University herbarium specimen that had been misidentified as Trapa natans. The pond is covered about 50% by water chestnut, and the company that owns the pond was completely unaware of Trapa until I contacted them. However, in 2018, they reported that they had a contract with a local pond management company to treat the pond, which is fabulous. The next largest colony was Wellington Road. It's a federal facility. It was first noticed in 2016 by a property maintenance contractor for the property, and it was reported to Virginia Game and Inland Fisheries in the fall of 2017, and they informed me. However, in 2018, they still did not have any plan for treatment. This is the map of 2018. So starting in 2016, I had 8 sites. By 2017, I had 18. And by the end of 2018, I had more than 30 sites. And many of these ponds and lakes are not well monitored or managed. There's no EDRR plan, no funding for further investigations on the pace of spread. The colors of these symbols represent the earliest records are in green. Yellow is between 2010 and 2014, and the red ones are the ones discovered between 2015 and 2018. There's an inset where we blew up the Fairfax County and the area around Clifton, so you could see those sites better. There's quite a few in the town of Clifton. So invasive Trapa in the U.S. Is typically managed with hand pulling or treatment with herbicides. In both cases, the ideal timing is before the seeds occur. In this photograph A, if Trapa is pulled up before it fruits, it can be composted in a corral right in the water. But if the seeds have formed, the pulled up plants should be composted in an upland site. Photograph B is a man throwing a rake, and it's on a long line, and it's used to pull the plants up close to shore. And this same man was very inventive. He had a private pond, and he simply used a single wire fence around the edge of the pond to deter geese from entering the pond. So goose dispersal can be inhibited if ponds are fenced or if geese populations are controlled. This is a figure showing federal agency investments on invasive species activities from 2014. Investments in EDRR, the second line of defense after prevention, received less than half of the resources dedicated to long-term control and management efforts. 90% of that money is spent on agricultural pest EDRR. So there is a lack of funding towards EDRR to protect landscapes and aquatic areas. Urgent need for Trapa, early detection and rapid response. If water chestnut is allowed to establish itself in ponds, it could quickly spread into tidal water. We could face an epic control challenge that would both undo past decades of successful eradication effort and undermine more recent estuarine water quality improvements that have resulted in restoration of an increasingly diverse and abundant population of submerged aquatic vegetation. I have several questions I've developed. How can we increase outreach and raise awareness to monitor and manage ponds and lakes or tidal waters? Can managers, conservation groups, extension agents, and pond permitting programs better coordinate to communicate with municipalities and landowners about EDRR and monitor the pace of spread across these jurisdictions? Could existing agricultural conservation networks, grants, or incentives be used to also protect landscapes and aquatic areas? I have numbers of people to acknowledge, and there are also many more to acknowledge, and those acknowledgements are included in the Chorak et al. Article that's in Press and Aquatic Botany. And that is the end.
Okay, so you have these questions. Did you want to ask them to the audience, or if anybody in the audience would like to chime in with some questions of their own, they are more than welcome to type their questions into the chat box. So one of my questions was actually if there is any sort of education or outreach effort on this this particular Trapa, outside of, you know, hey, there's Trapa in this general area. Is there anything specific on education on how to identify the two apart? Or I know out in the West Minnesota and so forth area, they have things like boat cleaning stations and signage and stuff like that. Is there anything going on in that particular area for the Trapa issue?
Well, I guess you could say things are starting. The problem is, you know, we had great input when it was thought to be a tidal water issue, and signage was put up at boat ramps, but it's more of a pond issue. So nobody is seeing that type of signage that, you know, owns a pond.
Yeah.
So the question is, how do you get to those people? How do you make them aware? What is the network that you would use to talk to public, private, city, county, park, and state lake and pond owners?
Wow, that definitely is a broad group.
Yeah, very multi-jurisdictional, and probably the same, you know, problem that many people are finding is an issue when you try to respond quickly to insects or plants or bacteria, whatever. How do you get the information to the people that are going to encounter the species?
Yeah, definitely. And I assume it's a problem, especially if a pond is owned or used by an individual pond owned or used by a lot of different people. Either it's owned by a community or it's owned, you know, you have your area of beach you have access to and you quote unquote own. That's a really big issue, and I'm sure they're seeing it with a lot of these other aquatic pond and lake and river owners.
Right. Right. And some of these ponds, you know, someone will inform me that is in like works with stormwater ponds, that right across the way the community shopping center has a stormwater pond, which is not in the county stormwater pond jurisdiction. It's a private pond, and I don't even know who to contact that, you know, developed the shopping center to tell them that they have a problem, you know, and to encourage them to control the water chestnut.
Oh, of course. Has anybody had any theories on how this species came to the U.S.?
Well, you know, I don't know if anybody else has any theories, but what I would think, after seeing how well those barbed spines can attach to any kind of material, like a rope, for example. So it could have been brought a long distance on an anchor rope, but it's probably, because it's medicinal and it's eaten in other countries, it's very likely that somebody brought it over and put it in their pond because they wanted it near them.
Okay, yeah, that's a great point. There have been a lot of things brought over for either medicinal value or for like herbs that they would use in their cooking at home, or even just plants that they really liked from home. They'll bring those to wherever they move.
Exactly.
So I'm not seeing any chat questions at the moment. Is there anything you'd like to say before we head out?
Just thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to make this webinar.
Yes, it was both you and Lee had great topics. This was a great way to start off NISAW. And by getting, your research out there, it'll definitely, especially since it seems to be, as you mentioned, transported by waterfowl, I'm sure this is going to become a much broader problem than it started out with.
Right.
So I'd like to thank Lee and thank Nancy for joining us today. And I'd like to thank our attendees for coming. This webinar will be made available. I'm not certain exactly where, if it'll be on the NAIPC website or if it'll be on YouTube or where it might show up, but it will be made available. So thank you to everyone, and I hope that many of you will join us for our next webinar. That will be again tomorrow at the same time. We'll have one presentation, and I'd like to see everyone there. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca.